philanthropy and social investment. Today's webinar is called The Role of PSOs and CSOs in Advocating in Technology. When I say PSOs and CSOs, I'm referring to philanthropy support organizations and civil society organizations. This webinar was designed to be accessible for PSOs and CSOs interested in engaging in discussions around technology without a technical background in technology. So in this webinar, we'll explore the importance of civil society and philanthropy being at the table and informed in tech conversations to help guide ethics and practice relating to inclusion. Why must philanthropy and civil society be in tune to technological developments? What are or have been the ramifications when they haven't? What roles do they play in guiding conversations around technology and advocating for people in technologically sound advances? So not all CSOs and PSOs have the capability to plug into conversations around tech, but as it's developing faster and faster every day, it's now more important than ever that we vaguely know what's going on and how these new advances can affect us and where we can enter into this conversation. CSOs and PSOs can act as a kind of compass around tech development. So in this webinar, we're going to cover how to engage in these type of discussions and provide examples of other CSOs and PSOs doing this and show what resources are available to us. Today, we have Chris Warman with us from TechSoup and Rhodri Davies from CAF, and these two people are experts in the intersection between philanthropy and technology. So after their presentations, we're going to have a bit of a more informal discussion, and we really encourage you to ask any questions or bring up any points that you would like to talk to experts about. So without further ado, I'll introduce Rhodri Davies from CAF. And CAF is a charity, bank, and champion for better giving, and for over the last 90 years, they've been helping donors, companies, and charities make a bigger impact. I'll let Rhodri Davies tell you a bit more about his role and how he deals with tech at CAF. And Rhodri, I'm passing the ball to you so that you'll be able to go through your PowerPoint.
Okay, great. And I'm assuming I'm unmuted now and everyone can hear me. If there's any problems, do let me know. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. I'm delighted to be back for the second in the series, having been involved in the first one, which was a kind of broader look at issues around technology and civil society. And I guess the starting point, just to say a bit about my background and interest in this. So I head up policy at Charities Aid Foundation, CAF, which is a UK-based registered charity with a network of 9 partner offices around the world. A lot of what I do is kind of straightforward voluntary sector policy work, but most relevant for this, I also head up a thing called Giving Thought, which is essentially our in-house think tank. So it's a space we've carved out to think about some of the issues affecting philanthropy and civil society from a slightly bigger picture and longer term perspective. And one of the things that I've been working on for about 4 years or so now is looking at some of the questions raised by the impact of emerging and disruptive technologies on civil society. And I'm just going to run through a few slides here, kind of hopefully framing a bit of the discussion before I hand on to Chris. Just in terms of, sorry, how do I, Sarah, sorry. Oh, no, I got you, it's okay, it's fine. There we go. Great. So just in terms of overall framing, apologies to anybody who was a participant in the first webinar in the series, because you may have seen this slide before. I do use it quite a lot. But I think it's just a good way of kind of framing this whole issue about why I think at this moment in time, all of us in civil society need to be paying attention to technology, because I think a lot of issues that seem as though they are technology issues aren't any longer. They're actually wider societal issues that affect all of us in various ways. And the 3 ways in which I think it's useful to think about this. So One is the positive way in which technology can be put to use to achieve social and environmental missions, and that's the sort of basis of the whole tech for good movement. And there are lots of great examples of technologies like artificial intelligence or blockchain being put to use in things like medical research or conservation or kind of international development, but that's sort of less the focus of what we're talking about today. The second way, which I think opens the discussion out a bit to a wider range of organizations who might not feel that technology is kind of front and center for them, is the way in which technology is going to have an impact on the wider operating environment for organizations of all kinds, including civil society. And I'm thinking there of the impact that it's going to have on regulation and finance, and on things specific to civil society, like the ways in which people are able to volunteer their time or to give money. And I think there are some positives there, but that's when we start to see the ways in which I think there are potentially challenges. We may talk about this later, but just to give an example of what I mean, the increasing use of things like voice-activated and voice-operated assistants like Amazon's Alexa means that we're starting to see those being used as platforms for giving. And obviously they are underpinned by artificial intelligence systems that are owned by a particular platform or company. And actually what we aren't seeing is the decision processes underneath those that decide which information we're being presented with. So actually we're never getting a full picture of the world. And when it comes to giving to charity or to civil society, actually that could have a determinate impact if some of those platforms are making decisions on our behalf about which organizations are or aren't making it onto the platform in the first place. And we've already seen problems in a wider context when organizations like Google or Facebook have taken decisions to censor information in order to meet the requirements of repressive regimes around the world. And it would be a real concern if the same thing happened to people's ability to give in the future. And that's just an example of the sort of challenge we need to think about. And then I think more widely than that, and I think really the answer to why, the question of why we all need to care about this, is the fact that even if you as an organization or a funder don't feel as though technology is something you want to use yourself and you're not particularly concerned about the impact on you as an organization, it's almost certainly going to have an impact on the people and communities that you are trying to serve and to help. And if you don't understand the nature of that impact and the changes that it's going to make to the underlying needs those people have, you are probably going to find that you are less relevant to those people and communities in the future, and that's going to be very problematic. And just to give some illustrative examples of the sorts of things that I mean by this, that hopefully show that it's really, I think, about a mindset of thinking through technology issues through the lens of things that we as civil society organizations actually think about much more on a day-to-day basis. I just want to give a couple of examples to kind of just show that it's more about that than it is about actually kind of digging into the underlying technical details of particular platforms or technologies. So one issue as an example that we really, I think, need to be aware of now is algorithmic bias. So this is related to artificial intelligence, it often gets called, more specifically machine learning, which is a particular subset of artificial intelligence. But essentially this is applying automated decision processes where you don't program the rules in up front. You allow them to learn on vast sets of data, and they refine themselves to get better and better at doing certain things. Now they themselves, the processes, are not biased, but the data that they learn from almost inevitably does contain historical statistical biases. And if over time you don't do anything to address that, the system starts to demonstrate and actually strengthen those biases. And this is a problem we're already seeing quite a lot in practice, where in policing, for instance, they're using algorithms to predict where crimes might take place, and those tend to show bias against particular ethnic groups or demographic groups. Similarly, in the US, they have used machine learning systems to try and set bail conditions within the justice system, and those have shown very strong racial bias. And this is, an issue, a rights issue that people are starting to advocate on now, but very determinantly will affect people and communities that civil society traditionally is there to support. Another example that's linked to that I think we're all very aware of is the impact that artificial intelligence has had in the form of enabling propaganda and misinformation to be very, very carefully targeted to specific groups or even individuals in order to sway their opinions and beliefs and to influence things like the electoral process. And we've obviously seen this in the context of the furore around Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, and the impact of Russian interference on the US election. And this is a problem, I think, that if you are aware of what's going on in terms of AI development, is going to get much worse in the short term, because we are already seeing the development of AI-generated audio and video material that is virtually indistinguishable from genuine audio and video. And obviously, if people are able to present that kind of evidence in order to make a case or to present misinformation, that is going to make it much more difficult to determine what is true objective fact and what isn't. And that will have potentially a very negative effect on the sphere for public discourse and civil society. Just to take a much bigger example, but I think one that is absolutely inescapable, is inequality. That's already an issue that a lot of us are aware is kind of one of the defining issues and problems of our time. A key question for the development of any technology, I think, is it going to reduce or increase inequality? There is a risk, I think, that many of the technologies we're now starting to see coming to the forefront, if not developed with adequate thought, will increase inequality, even if that's not the intention, and potentially even create new forms of inequality. So there's been a lot of concern about the impact of automation on the workforce and the possibility that there will be very, very large-scale loss of jobs in the future. But that impact is likely to be felt very unequally, both between countries and possibly between the global north and global south, and even within countries between urban and rural areas. So it will introduce very stark inequality between different geographies and different communities, potentially. And those are just some examples without going into too much detail. And there are plenty more that I could get dragged into, but I won't, because I'm aware I'm trying to keep my time limited. And then just to hopefully spark some thought for the debate and to lead on to what Chris is going to be saying, these are just some further examples of the kinds of big picture questions, I think, when it comes to civil society thinking about the impact of technology, that we need to be addressing. So it's not so much about the particular features of any one technology or kind of how it works under the hood. It's more about the things that it makes possible and how those relate to the impact on people and communities that civil society serves and the work of civil society itself. And hopefully we'll come on to talk more about many of these in the discussion in a little bit. Okay, I think that's my bit done.
Thank you so much, Rodri. We'll get back to these questions, and we can also put them on the screen. We can put them back on the screen at the end. Our next speaker is from TechSoup, whose mission is to build a dynamic bridge that enables civil society organizations and change makers around the world to gain effective access to the resources that they need to design and implement technology solutions for a more equitable planet. We have with us today Chris Warman from TechSoup, and allow him to introduce himself a little bit more and how his role feeds into philanthropy and technology. Thank you, Chris.
Certainly, and thank you all for having me this morning. Can you hear me all right?
Perfectly, thank you.
Super. So yes, good morning from the Bay Area. As was mentioned, I'm with TechSoup. I'm our Vice President of Partnerships and Program Development, but my background is in building local philanthropy. I spent about 10 years in Eastern Europe working on building community foundations, and then a little bit later digital movements to work on governance, transparency, and accountability. So I'm very happy to be here today because the Wings community has been close to my heart for a long time. Most of you know us in the TechSoup sense as a product donation platform. So we help NGOs get and use technology. We reach about 1.2 million NGOs across all non-US embargoed states. We've effectively served at least one NGO in every country on the planet at this point, which is pretty exciting, gives us a lot of insight into who is civil society, where is civil society, what are their technology challenges, what are they struggling with, and a lot of communications capacity. So in any given week, about 900,000 NGOs around the world will open an email from us in one of 50 languages. They'll come to offline events for technology training. They'll come to online courses. Lots of work around, again, technology access and adoption. My job, though, is sort of a layer above that. What do we do with this data? What do we do with this community that is formed? All of these NGOs and the people that work there, how do we exercise some ability to have a discussion with civil society at that kind of scale about the things that it finds really meaningful? Naturally, this brings us into contact with the good and the bad of technology, the lack of understanding about how to work with tech, and sometimes that means talking specifically on very sort of meta levels about policy itself. You know, something that Rodri mentioned was the Facebook, Google, others potentially being able to limit who appears in search results. This is a really critical issue that we're all thinking about and dealing with in policy terms. To put it a different way, it's been said that philanthropy is private resources being spent on public good. So the ability for private citizens to use their private capital in private ways to then influence something public, giving to their hospitals or their churches or their schools or what have you, and that is a respected institution. Nothing is private anymore, though, if that's on the internet. That's hosted on servers that governments can read. If any of that happened on Facebook or happened via email, it's out there in the public domain, and it is in a public domain that is not owned by civil society. It's owned by governments. It's owned by the corporations that run that infrastructure, which raises, again, some interesting questions about what is the concept in very fundamental terms of philanthropy in this digital age. Sometimes we're grappling with more direct programming, like working with foundations to use machine learning, again, something Rodri brought up, to understand over 20 or 50 years of investment exactly how their grants are working. Imagine you're somebody like the Open Society Foundation or Ford or Rockefeller. You've been given grants for a long time. The information on those grants is in PDFs, Word documents, print documents that are filed in a basement somewhere. It makes it very hard for them to understand impact, something we all know philanthropy is quite concerned with. This is a space where machine learning can be really fascinating and helpful. There's almost no way humans can read that amount of information and process it. Machines can, and they can do it quickly. Let the machines read the documents, create some sense of order, and help you understand what the right questions to ask might be. Sometimes it means really, I would say, more entry-level data projects. I sit on the board of an organization called Catalyst in the Balkans, which some of you may have heard of, which we started by doing press clippings. Back in, must have been 6 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about how people in the Balkans don't give. You know, there isn't a strong culture of philanthropy here. And Nathan, who runs Catalyst, was quite convinced otherwise and began a press clipping service. Press clipping services, they've been around a long time. Every day he would get a press clipping packet of articles, news stories, video sometimes from local TV, radio clippings from all over the Balkans that had one of the key words he was searching for: philanthropy, volunteer, donate, gift. He had a range of about 40 keywords, and he would hand type those into a spreadsheet so he could build an argument about where and when philanthropy was actually happening on a local level in the Balkans. Much to our surprise, it was much bigger than we'd expected. Something on the order of 7 times as much money was being given locally by local people than was being given by international aid. So a huge philanthropic sector that hadn't been mapped before. So there's a data project for you, right? This is a way of using technology to understand what's going on around us. And it raises another interesting point that Rotary, I thought of that while Rotary was speaking, because it speaks to representation. Whose data are we able to count? Whose data are we not able to count? This is an enormous challenge in the algorithmic bias point that Rotary was saying. Most of us in civil society, work with disenfranchised communities. They're poor, they're elderly, they're rural, they're not rich urbanites. This became very stark in the data and technology sense around one of my favorite apps, SeeClickFix. You can look it up, seeclickfix.com. It's an NGO where individuals can report a local problem through their mobile phone. Somebody pointed out a few years into their existence of doing a really good job of getting citizens engaged with local governments on fixing challenges, that they were really only getting reports from people who had smartphones. Seems kind of obvious, right? But the people who had smartphones in this case, this was probably 8 years ago, were individuals who could afford them. Perhaps that wasn't exactly what people were looking for, creating a really good map of rich neighborhoods that had small problems. Again, there's a lot to think about there, like in Catalyst, in all of these projects, about whose data is being counted. A lot of that brings me around to a point of how do you even know which questions to ask? We work quite a bit with getting us towards a place where CEOs, directors, executive directors, managers in civil society can come to the point of reading a technology budget or a technology program plan the way they could read a financial budget. This has got to become a basic competency for us. As Rotary was saying, everything is going online, whether we like it or not. Our information, our transactions, our data, the way we talk to and work with people, especially the way the next generations, the children and youth that will become the stewards of our programs and ideas in the future, work and communicate, it's going online. If we don't have a sense of how that works, then we're really setting ourselves up to be obsolete. We're setting ourselves up for other people to come and build massive communities online right around us and potentially miss a lot of the good learning that we've all had and developed over the years. The way I think a lot of us are trying to get CEOs to think about that beyond just understanding a technical competency, how would you become able to read a technical plan, is to get right back to a rights-based approach. Thinking about how would you want your data represented? How would you want your information represented? How does it make you feel to know that this webinar is working over government and corporate-controlled digital technologies, that as much as I trust Wings, and I do, that there are other state actors who could very easily be listening to this conversation right now, recording it and tracing that information back. When you signed up for this webinar, you gave probably an email address, a name, potentially an organization name. Some of you might come from countries, but that association could essentially go into a digital file that could be used against you if the government doesn't happen to like civil society. How does that make you feel? Think about that for a second. How does it make you feel that some of your data on the people you serve in your countries is probably being collected in very much the same way? I specifically ask how you feel because it's important to build an empathetic understanding of this, that we put ourselves, our partners, and our beneficiaries in this position of the question about how do I feel? What would I need? What would I want to feel safe? Empathy is and always has been a first step in building a sense of rights, civil and human rights. If it doesn't make you feel good, there's probably something there to think about. And the fact of the matter is we have very few laws that govern technology and data right now. We need them, and we collectively have got to build a sense of what is right with a capital R, the human and civil rights of the digital era. This is something that only civil society is going to do. The corporate sector is not going to do it itself. The government often won't or can't, and it's our space to build that understanding. It's one that we're not very well prepared to lead. It's one that we don't have a choice but to think about. If you want to begin thinking about this, I would suggest that the first thing to do is either you or someone you designate on your team begins learning about this space so that you can begin to craft arguments about how you would want to represent your people and their digital rights. Fundamentally, it's kind of like voting. This whole, if you don't vote, you can't complain. We have got to engage in this discussion with technology because technology isn't going to stop. As one recently said, we're kind of like cavemen right now when it comes to technology. Ooh, it's really warm and it cooks my food. Oh no, I'm on fire. And while that might be funny, it's time to think about a rights-based approach that will help us not catch fire so that we can get a good understanding of what works with technology in all of its best senses and what we need to avoid before our data is simply gone and being used against us. That wasn't a very happy note, and I'm sorry about that, but I do think it's a critical thing for all of us to think about. I will suggest a list of places that you can go to start learning more. The good news is there are at least a dozen organizations who are very deeply involved in this and work globally, from the Open Government Partnership, Access Now, Internet Society, Stanford PAX, Mozilla, the World Economic Forum, Business and Human Rights Technology. There's all sorts of people. And importantly, I would suggest look around in your own country where these discussions are being had. I found in my time outside of the US that they were happening between software development associations. There's one in almost every country, and the chambers of commerce. So British, German, Austrian, American, Japanese chambers of commerce in your country tend to be very influential in how technology law is written in countries, because they have a lot to gain or lose depending on how those laws are written. It's a great place to go. They tend to be civil society too and open to working on rights-based approach. I'll stop there. Thanks, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that excellent presentation, and Rodri. We have some discussion points on the screen, and I think this is a really good opportunity to utilize the experts that we have in the room to ask any questions that you might have or even any ideas you might have. So we're going to try and unmute everyone who's on this call and see what happens as a bit happens. If you have any questions, I received one on the chat box, so if you have any questions, you can speak up, and then we'll see how this works with everyone unmuted. So I have one question that I received on the chat box, and it's how do we increase our skill set around technology? What specific resources are available to EDs or for staff training online? And I guess you can say online or in person.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything, Chris, or shall I kick off? Okay, I mean, I guess, I'd say with that, absolutely. There is part of this that is about skills development. I mean, I'll come back to what I said earlier, which is that I think for the majority of people in civil society, this is not about feeling as though you have to go out there and learn to code or even kind of, get to grips with the fundamentals of how blockchain works or all the different varieties of AI. It is about finding ways of feeling sufficiently confident that you understand the technologies in terms of the kind of the capabilities and the affordances that they bring to the table and the kind of trends that we're seeing, and then relate those to your more sort of central core concerns and work. And the good news on that front is I think there are quite a few organizations already doing some of that work on your behalf. So, certainly there's an enormous amount of interest in the commercial world in what blockchain means for, the insurance industry or logistics or these sorts of things. And the same is true around artificial intelligence. And actually something that I found in my work is it's often, it's only a very small leap from that version of having distilled the features of the technology to make it relevant to one domain to, okay, many of those same things apply to civil society, because fundamentally we are all, organizations operating within it. So anything that is about organizational forms or the way in which organizations operate is likely to be relevant. And often in terms of those wider societal issues, some of that will come through. The other place beyond the commercial world, I think, where it's worth looking is that there are increasingly, I think, a number of think tanks or kind of dedicated organizations looking at some of these societal and ethical implications, particularly around artificial intelligence. So in the UK, there's the Alan Turing Institute, the Ada Lovelace Institute, who are funded by organizations like the Leverhulme Foundation and Wolfson, and also a number of think tanks looking at the kind of rights implications particularly. And also organizations like Amnesty are doing a lot of work around this area. And again, I would say that they are doing a lot of very interesting work, and I think sort of pushing a lot of this conversation about the social implications of this and some of the ethical questions forward. The thing that concerns me is just that when I look at those organizations and those debates, they're still very largely driven and held by either the tech industry or the tech industry and a kind of small subset of the academic world. And it's not necessarily that they have malign intentions, it's just that they have a very particular perspective and often kind of commercial considerations. So I worry that if they are allowed to define what the problems are and what the criteria of ethics or morality are, without the involvement of wider civil society, that we will not get the results that we should be getting.
Have said it better. I completely agree. I also put some notes in the chat box. A couple of places that one is Electronic Freedom Foundation. They've got some courses. TechSoup over the last 2 years has been building quite a significant course catalog. Many of the courses are free. Some of them are sort of following the traditional TechSoup pricing model, so about $10, whereas on the fair market they would cost you hundreds. In particular, there's one around technology planning that I think is fantastic. And it's about 4 to 5 hours of online coursework that is a great crash course in just thinking from your organization's perspective about some of these issues. And then a whole list of people you might want to check out. Again, some of the ones I mentioned, like the OGP, Access Now, et cetera. But completely agree with Rodri. I feel like there are far too many of these discussions that are happening in spaces controlled by people who have the most interest in them, which always makes me a little bit nervous, and that there isn't yet a great forum for this discussion to happen in a truly civil society sense. There's been some noise at the United Nations. It's hard, though, because they can easily become confrontational conversations between the need of the digital economy to have lots of rights or have lots of access to data that we might not want them to have, because that's how their business models work. It's going to be a long and hard conversation to disentangle those two things and get to a point where we have a healthier digital economy, less reliant on personal data, and still have access to some of the benefits that that data generates for us.
Thank you for those resources. I think at the end of this call, we can compile them and also send them to people who registered, and you can share them with your networks as we keep this discussion going. I want to open up the floor if anyone has any questions. I see that Hiba may have a question, and you are unmuted, so you can ask.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Clear. Great, wonderful. My question to Rodri and Chris, thank you first for the presentation. I understand that from what you're talking, the discussion is that it's a very embryonic movement. But are there any examples that you can point out of where foundations or civil society organizations have actually thought about the return on investment or the impact of integrating technology in their operations? That's my question.
Yes. So there are certainly people who've thought about that both from the more kind of the bigger, more meta discussion standpoint. And that's where I would encourage you to check out the Stanford Philanthropy, it's called PAX, Philanthropy and Civil Society, run by Lucy Bernholtz. Lucy every year publishes sort of a manifesto on the state of civil society and technology, primarily and particularly in regard to organized and structured philanthropy, so sort of from the foundation sense. There are others like MacArthur and Ford who've done a lot of work on that, Kellogg as well. Happy to compile some of those resources for sharing after this, looking at it both from their own institutional selves and how technology has helped or not helped them, but also how they are approaching this with their grantees. So Ford Foundation, for instance, through the BUILD program, doing a lot of work around technology and trying to understand it both from its capacity building needs, but then also the potential impact. It's, you know, I think what a lot of people have found, which is probably not surprising to you, is it's very hard to talk about the benefits of technology if nobody can use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just add to that. I think there are certainly a lot of, or a handful of very interesting examples of organizations, whether those are funders or charities or non-profits, using technology in interesting ways and having made a strategic decision to do so. I mean, in terms of organizations using it to further their mission, a lot of the examples around AI, for instance, are in medical research. So here in the UK, there's an interesting project announced recently between Parkinson's UK, which obviously deals with Parkinson's disease, and an AI startup called Benevolent AI, where they are taking data on sort of minuscule body movements from smartphones and then applying machine learning to those to try and find early warning indicators of the onset of Parkinson's through involuntary movements. And they've obviously they won a challenge prize in order to do that. So they have some funding for doing it, but there are also a handful of medical research foundations out there, I think Wolfson and others, putting money in. The other ones that I would flag up, sort of relating to what we've been focusing on today, around organizations that have decided to upskill in order to address technology issues as they relate to their kind of core mission. I mentioned Amnesty already, and I think the same is true of Human Rights Watch, are doing a lot of work in this area and have quite large programs looking at the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning on the civic space. The other two areas where I've seen quite a lot happening, and charities and others deciding to put in resources, is probably where it makes the most immediate short-term sense, or it's easiest to see why it's necessary. So particularly around mental health, because there's a very obvious link there, I think, with technology increasingly being a kind of causal, or at least very highly correlated factor, and around issues to do with children and young people, where I think increasingly, if you aren't looking at least some of those issues through the lens of new technologies and how they're used, you are going to struggle to even reach those people in the first place. But I would say one area where I really feel like there is a gap, and a lot of people have said this to me, is in funding, foundation funding or other funding, for organizations to develop those skills and knowledge in the first place, so that they can kind of understand technology issues and how they relate to their particular cause area. And maybe that is because foundations themselves haven't quite sort of bought the argument that it is necessary to fund that. And maybe it's because the existing pots of money are coming from sources that are still kind of within that tech industry or governmental world. But there is definitely a need, I think, to try and fund civil society to develop those necessary skills so that it really can meaningfully enter some of these debates.
Are there any other questions from our participants? You can unmute yourself and ask directly, or if you have a comment you'd like to share.
Well, I would like to ask a question to both. One of the big problems here is, Andrea from IDIS, Brazil. One of the big problems philanthropy face here in Brazil is the lack of trust of the society in the nonprofit organizations. I know that blockchain can work for build a trustable system, but it's so complicated for the regular people. It looks very hard to explain and to understand. Do you see any other contribution of technology to help us with this, to deal with this lack of trust on the nonprofit sector?
That is a huge and very hard question. I wish there was an easy answer, and frankly, I don't think blockchain is necessarily it. I have seen some good work and research around blockchain and what is called self-sovereign identification, SSID. The idea there being that people use blockchain to build an identity, a digital identity that they are able to control and influence versus other people being able to control and influence. Rodri showed that picture of, that horrifying picture of the rather kind of floppy-haired individual being represented as Vladimir Putin on using some of the fake imagery technology that's out there right now. This is an incredibly hard issue, and we're really struggling globally with a direct attack on the concept of trust and truth. It's happening online. And I think a lot of the people I've been talking to are in the technology space are rather concerned that we're not going to be able to solve it online, because the ability to undermine digital trust is easy, it's cheap, and it can work much faster than our ability to present truth online. So there's a very kind of anti-technology movement growing around this concept, and an understanding that a lot of this is going to be based on education offline, helping people understand this offline, build that trust offline. It's not necessarily going to happen online. It raises a lot of questions. And I don't know, Rodri, if you have a happier answer for that, but when thinking about state-level intervention against the concept of trust and truth,
yeah, I think it's a tricky one, because I mean I've done quite a bit of work on blockchain myself, and it is often mentioned in the context of solving issues around trust. But I think, I mean, as Chris was sort of saying there, actually in many ways what it does is it just shifts where we place our trust away from non-profit organizations or the government or anything into the infrastructure of the technology. And if you believe that blockchain is entirely faultless, and you also believe it's truly distributed and that nobody is controlling it, then maybe you believe that is worth doing. I think there are kind of practical challenges to that, and actually in reality often most blockchain isn't actually as decentralized as you'd think, and people do have the ability to control it, because a small number of people control quite a large part of the ability to make decisions within the system. I mean, I guess Brazil is from my understanding of it, quite a particular context when it comes to issues around trust in the non-profit sector, and it could be that in that particular context there is something to be said for technology allowing new types of organizations and organizational forms to emerge that kind of bypass traditional civil society or the traditional non-profit sector in that context, and still attempt to achieve the same thing, but don't have the same historical and cultural challenges when it comes to trust. In lots of other contexts, that phenomenon worries me, because I see a lot of very well-meaning, often startup projects coming from the tech world that are trying to address very long-standing intractable problems that everybody in civil society knows are extremely difficult and complicated and multidimensional. And these people will often come in with a sort of disruptive startup mindset and assume they don't need to engage with anybody who's worked on these things before, and all they need to do is come in and kind of bring their tech insight to it, and it'll all be solved. And at best, sometimes that just falls flat, and at worst, I would be very concerned about the impact on vulnerable people and communities that are seen as kind of the guinea pigs for experimentation of that kind. So, you know, I don't think technology, to answer your question, solves the issues of trust. It changes the nature of them, but I think we still fundamentally have to come back and kind of address those very difficult issues ourselves as a sector.
The floor is open if anyone has any questions. I received one on the chat box, and let me read it to you. It's, I think it's directed to Rotary, and if anyone is making a case for foundations to fund tech education, if any philanthropy support organizations are mobilizing foundations around this issue that you were talking about.
I'd say I've been going on about it for a little bit now, but I'm just one person. Hopefully, I'm not sort of shouting into the void. I mean, I have certainly found that I've been talking to a lot of either kind of membership organizations for funders or infrastructure organizations, and that message has been well received. So obviously, you know, Wings have organised this webinar series. The Association of Charitable Foundations in the UK, I've done some things with them. You know, other organisations like the International Centre for Non-Profit Law, with a specific focus, are kind of looking at bringing their expertise to some of the issues around the impact of technology on civic space. So I think there are people interested in this. I did an article for Alliance magazine at the start of the year about precisely this issue. What I don't know that argument has yet been won, and it's kind of resulted in any large number of foundations sort of shifting their focus to it. I think, as Chris said, there are some interesting examples, probably more in the US than anywhere else, of big funders starting to have at least a program around this kind of thing. But I do still think it's a big gap in the funding landscape.
I might chime in on that. I completely agree. It is a big gap, and I think part of that is what, you know, Rotary, you brought it up a little bit earlier. Foundations, the philanthropic sector, you know, and no offense intended, is not necessarily the most progressive when it comes to its own technologies. There are very few foundations out there who have their own technology officers who think about these things in sort of deep or progressive manner, because they don't really have to. Most of them haven't had to think about this because they're not doing the kind of on-the-ground service level work that most of their grantees are. So that has led to, I think, sort of a market disconnect. And I'm really happy to see foundations becoming aware of this, becoming often afraid from their own perspective of the security risks to the organizations that they serve. Because if one of the organizations they serve gets in trouble, gets their data hacked, gets put out of business for various reasons, then they lose one of their grantees, people that they love and invest in. So there is a rising awareness. It's moving very slowly. And the ability to open up grants funding from particularly American foundations who have in their mission and in their founding documents often very particular focus that doesn't include technology, it's a challenge. You know, the Ford was a technologist. He brought us the kind of mass-produced motor car. He was dealing with fascinating technology, but in the Ford Foundation's kind of concept, investing in technology just isn't really there. Again, to be clear, they're doing very good work. They've made it work, but it's very slow. We're trying to get the Bay Area engaged in this. We're trying to get some of the people that have, you might say, started some of these problems to use the enormous wealth that has been generated by the technology platforms to reinvest in exactly these issues in their own and our kind of collective long-term self-interest. Not easy, not necessarily fast, but there are some baby steps. I think all of us have to take a personal responsibility, though, and look at what's out there, look at what's free, look at what's available, and simply start educating ourselves.
I'd just add to that as well. I think I totally agree, and I think the point about trying to engage with Silicon Valley and the wider tech community to try and address some of these challenges, given that many of them have kind of gone on the record saying that they're very concerned about them, absolutely makes sense. I suppose the difficulty that I would foresee with it potentially is that people who have made their money in a particular way, often when it comes to their philanthropy, that is reflected in the way in which they think problems need to be addressed. And that's very true, I think, of philanthropists who come from a tech background or have made their money that way. And that's certainly true up to a point. They can do some amazing good with the technologies that they've developed commercially and kind of achieve great social outcomes. Where it becomes difficult is where you have to start asking a question about, not just whether you can do something, but fundamentally whether you even should do it in the first place, which is the sort of question I think around the application of AI in some contexts needs to be asked. It's not about, how do we do it in a way that minimizes harm? It should be, a stage earlier than that, which is fundamentally, is it even worth the potential risks? And I think that question could be quite difficult to bring into the open if a large part of the funding is from organizations for whom the idea that technology is the starting point for the solution, if that's a kind of fundamental tenet. I'm not saying that has to be the case, but I could foresee that being a challenge.
Agreed, and I think, while I appreciate that, the challenge is the real politic of who has power in this discussion, and how do we work our values and ideals into that discussion so that it can be done with us and not to us. Let's all hope a couple of years from now we're enjoying a beautiful scenario in which we've been able as civil society to make our collective voice heard in those discussions and have more values-based decisions. I do think, though, that that's up to us to create that power and strength together, because the train is moving. Unfortunately, it's controlled by AI. It's a robot train.
And sorry, so I was just going to pick up on that quick, say just one sort of practical thing about that, Chris's point there. I agree. I mean, I think, and there is a big question in some of this when we're talking about this question in the title about the role of civil society in advocating, whether that is seen primarily as outsider advocating, so kind of working out what the problems are and then standing on the sidelines and sort of shouting at the tech industry, or whether it's more insider influencing in terms of trying to meet them halfway and actually engage with them around the kind of design and implementation. And both of those bring challenges with them. I think the effectiveness of outsider advocating, or the danger of being seen as a Luddite or as kind of swimming against the tide. But then on the flip side, the danger of being brought into the tech community and not actually getting the power balance right, so that you are merely there as kind of window dressing. That's equally a danger. I mean, I think in terms of the practical ways in which civil society organizations can start to engage now, beyond what we've been saying about kind of developing the understanding and skills, I think there are opportunities, and this will depend on domestic context, but there is a lot going on in policy terms at the moment in terms of governments looking at their strategies for developing AI within their country. I mean, there is essentially an AI arms race on at the moment in which everybody is trying to catch up with China and establish themselves as a world leader in AI. And I think there is an opportunity within those, where there's often consultation going on, to attempt to get a civil society perspective into it. I think there are also, as I said before, quite a lot of forums around AI ethics in various ways, many of them kind of transnational ones, and I can give some examples in the notes afterwards. And certainly here in the UK, the UK is very much trying to pitch itself as a world leader in terms of the ethical development of AI. One thing we've attempted to do in our work at CAF is not just to kind of speak about these issues within the sector, although that's very important, but to try and go to where these wider debates are being had and bring a very particular viewpoint to it, which does require getting confident enough with your understanding of the issues to be able to do that, but also having the confidence to feel as though the civil society perspective that you bring and that expertise is equally valuable. Because I think there's a danger you go into these tech conversations and feel as though, you know, if you don't have a developer background or you can't code, that you've got nothing worth saying. But equally, people from the tech community often don't have any deep understanding of social issues, or they don't know that wider context. And so they should value what we have to say, as long as we're able to meet them halfway.
Thank you both to you and Chris, Rodri and Chris, for being with us here today. I think if there's any further questions, you are free to send them to me, and maybe I can pose them to Rodri and Chris via email. We're going to collect all the resources that we discussed today and that are in the chat box, and we can send them to you if you registered for this webinar. And it will also be made available on our YouTube channel. So thank you to all the webinar participants who came. And if you have any further questions or comments, feel free to engage with the Wings Network as we take this conversation further. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Rodri.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.